I hope you guys will have the sound system fixed up before Howard gets here 2 weeks from now. But it's a warning. You should never have a sound system set up by a guy who got his degree in literature at Brown. You should get a good MIT student to set it up for you next time. Then it'll surely not work. Well, the late 70s, when South End got started, were kind of a low point in the ability and the opportunities to write and in other ways address general audiences. The major journals of the 1960s had collapsed. Ramparts, Liberation were gone, a couple others. There had been a few mainstream journals that had been open to dissident opinion, but those options had been mostly closed. There were some publishing opportunities, but they were pretty limited. When South End came along, later Z Magazine, that made quite a substantial difference and a major contribution to the growing popular movements, which have since, as Cynthia indicated, become quite unprecedented in scale globally and deep in the depth of their roots here as well. You don't read it in the headlines, but anyone who's involved in these activities is very well aware of it. The differences from earlier years are quite substantial. Just on a personal note, the first couple of books that I published with South End, first one was with Ed Herman, Political Economy of Human Rights. The next one was Fateful Triangle. Others, later years, Political Economy of Human Rights was 1979. Both of those books had sort of interesting histories which reflect the nature of the times. Ed and I had, in fact, written an earlier version of Political Economy of Human Rights. It was published by a mainstream publisher in 1974, but the publisher was owned by a conglomerate, Warner Communications, which is now part of Time, AOL, Warner, or some bigger thing. I lost track. A senior executive, they published 20,000 copies of it. A couple of ads came out. A senior executive of the corporation saw the ads and didn't like them, took a look at the book, and flew out the window or something like that, ordered the publisher to terminate publication. They refused. It was a long hassle. The end result was that the conglomerate put the publisher out of business, destroyed not only that book, but all their stock, totally. That was not considered a free speech issue in the United States. None of the free speech advocates thought there was anything wrong with this. After all, it's not state censorship, it's just corporate censorship, and that doesn't interfere with freedom of speech. So the fact that a publisher was put totally out of business, all their books destroyed, to prevent distribution of a single book has barely been mentioned. In fact, about the only person I can think of who's mentioned it is Ben Bagdikian, and his media monopoly, the various editions of that, has brought it up. It was brought to the attention of people who are very active in writing about free speech, but they correctly, from their point of view, said there's no issue. Well, that tells you something not only about the times, but about the principles. South End came along, and we were able to publish a much expanded edition of it. Of course, that's only for activists. There's a principle of journalism, journals of opinion, and so on, which is you never mention anything that departs from the party line. You got to keep to that rigidly. So you won't find mentions of it in the mainstream, but material's there. The second book also has an interesting history. I don't want to personalize too much, but if you're interested, I'll tell you about it. I happened to think about this history a couple days ago when I was reading the New York Review. There was an article there by the head of the Center for Human Rights at the Kennedy School, Carr Center, about genocide and about the failure of the United States to deter genocide. What's wrong with us that makes it so difficult for us to deter genocide when we see it? If you look at the examples, you can figure out the operational meaning of the term genocide. It means some crime that we can attribute to others. It doesn't matter what crime it was very much. In fact, you can say anything you like about it. You can make up stories or anything you want. But as long as we're not involved in it or we're not implementing it, then it can count as genocide. And many examples are given. Some of the, for example, the fact that the allegation that the Serbians carried out mass murder of 200,000 people in the early 90s. Just as a research project, you might want to look up the scholarly literature to find the sources for that. But it really doesn't matter. As long as you're criticizing someone else, it's fine. Don't need any evidence. Say anything you want. And it qualifies as genocide. There are other cases of, just since the number is given, of 200,000 people killed where the evidence is actually much better, but they're not mentioned. One of them, in fact, is discussed in Political Economy of Human Rights. By that time, the United States, and with Britain's help, had succeeded in killing off about 200,000 people in East Timor, but that doesn't count because we did. So therefore, it doesn't enter the annals of genocide. I don't use the term much myself, but in that case, it may be legitimate. That was maybe a third or a quarter of the population, and it got much worse. Later, the United States and Britain continued to support the slaughter right through the bitter end, mid-September 1999. But that doesn't count because it violates a principle. We were responsible for it consciously with eyes open. Therefore, it couldn't be recorded, and it doesn't enter the history of genocide. There was another case which we couldn't mention in that book because it was just about beginning then. We talked about the early stages. Another 200,000 people in Central America, roughly, for which the United States is directly responsible. Therefore, that doesn't enter. And we can list lots of others. But some do enter when you can claim with whatever evidence, in this case none, that 200,000 people were killed by an official enemy. One case that is discussed in the article where the term genocide is indeed commonly used and with some justification is the case of Cambodia, which we also discussed in that book. And it's discussed, and there the term is perhaps not unreasonable. In fact, there is one governmental study by a government, an independent government, of what happened in Cambodia. As far as I'm aware, the only place where it's ever discussed is in work that Ed and I did. The reason is because of the title, which gives it away. It's called The Decade of Genocide. This was the government of Finland, incidentally, carried out a study of what they called the Decade of Genocide, 1969 to 1979. But since it's the Decade of Genocide, it can't be mentioned. Because that includes the years 1969 to 1975, when the United States was responsible for the atrocities and the massacres. So therefore, that's out. There is a Cambodia Genocide Act passed by Congress, but it is very sharply restricted. Begins mid-April 1975 and ends early January 1979. That is precisely the period when you can't attribute all the atrocities to the United States and its clients. And this article by the head of the Human Rights Center keeps to those conditions. The article does properly refer, it points out correctly that there was no difficulty finding out what was going on at that time. And the author cites the best authority, Charles Twining, who was he was a leading specialist on the topic. He was the top State Department head of, he was the Cambodia watcher in the Bangkok embassy for the State Department and really was the top expert, exactly as the author points out. And you can find out what he wrote, for example, in the book that Ed and I published with South End, where we cited his testimony to Congress and what he and his colleagues were saying. But contrary to what this author says, I don't think there was ever any other citation of what he said at the time. And the reason was that what he was saying was precisely the opposite of what the author attributes to him. He and his colleagues were saying that there is no, in their words, mass genocide, just brutal, rapid change and lots of deaths from hunger and disease. And contrary to the claim of the author, he doesn't say 2 million. In fact, he says maybe they say maybe tens or hundreds of thousands, the result of brutal rapid change, not mass genocide. Twining also points out that you have to be very, like everyone else who's serious, that you have to be extremely careful in dealing with refugee reports, and makes various other comments which were unacceptable at the time. So the fact is that although he is the top specialist, authors write about that, he was, as far as I'm aware, never mentioned, except in our book. Maybe you can find another mention. So that's Southend at least made it possible to cite the person who's now recognized as the top specialist, as he should have been, but he's recognized now with the claim that he said the opposite of what he in fact said. You can check it out and see for yourself. That's the fact that the observation by the top U.S. specialists that tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of people had died from brutal, rapid change, hunger, disease, and so on was not very surprising at the time in the light of the conditions. One high U.S. official predicted in 1975 that about 1 million people would die just from the effects of the U.S. war, which had wiped out the country. The U.S. aid mission, the last one that left, predicted several years of slave labor in order just to reconstitute the destruction. But that's all out of history because of the same principle. It's attributed to the wrong agent. What's in history is what fits. What doesn't matter whether it happened, but as long as it sort of fits the story that's within history. Well, one of the great things about Southend is that it's possible to report what's the information given by State Department intelligence, even if it doesn't happen to fit the party line, which it typically doesn't, incidentally. So that's very good, and there are many other examples like it. I won't talk about the other book, Fateful Triangle, because I don't want to harp on this, but let me just mention that those two books, first ones of mine that happen to be published by Southend, they're both about topics which are right in the headlines now, international terrorism and West Asia, what's called the Middle East, and countries that are committed to a kind of a Eurocentric bias elsewhere in the world. It's called West Asia properly. And of course they're all over the headlines today, both of those topics. Say this morning's front page headlines tell you about new plans for nuclear war fighting, which are justified on the basis of the threat of international terrorism. There are other things that they don't tell you, however. One thing that they don't tell you is that the plans aren't new. In fact, they're old. It's true that they're a little bit modified, but they've been around for a long time, even if the press and the journals decided it wasn't a nice idea to publish them, though they knew about them. The plans were initiated in March 1990, immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which made it very clear that there is no longer any deterrent. Okay, that was the crucial thing that took place when the Berlin Wall fell and sort of the end of the junior superpower. So now there's no deterrent, and Pentagon war planning changed very quickly by a couple of months later, by March 1990. Well, this is public, incidentally. It shifted from what's called planning to attack what's called in Pentagon jargon a weapons-rich environment. That's the Soviet Union. They're weapons-rich, to a target-rich environment, which is the rest of the world. It's not weapons-rich, but target-rich. Primarily what's called the South. That's not a geographical term. That means anybody outside of the United States and its clients and allies. So target the South, and the planning, the pretext shifted from the Russians are coming, which had been the pretext up until November 1989, to a new reason, namely the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's why we needed this huge military system, including a nuclear system, which did have to be modified, because now that we were, now that it was aimed at a target-rich environment, you needed different kind of devices, mini nukes and so on. In fact, the kind that are being discussed in the new nuclear plans that are being added now. It has to be targeted at what they called smaller countries capable of producing weapons of mass destruction. Well, who is capable of producing weapons of mass destruction? Any country that has a high school chemistry laboratory is capable of producing weapons of mass destruction. In fact, it's not that hard. So that's a pretty broad category. And they're to be targeted with nuclear weapons, including mini nukes. Just to give you the flavor of it from the Clinton years, here's a crucial document. It's called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrents, released in 1995. So this isn't Bush and unilateralism and all this business. So here's a couple of quotes. It says, the United States is top-level strategic command, the top-level planning agency that deals with nuclear weapons. The U.S. should have available the full range of responses, but nuclear weapons are the most important because, most of these are quotes, because unlike chemical or biological weapons, the extreme destruction from a nuclear explosion is immediate, with few, if any, palliatives to reduce its effect. Then it says, although we are not likely, notice, likely, although we're not likely to use nuclear weapons unless than matters of the greatest national importance or in less than extreme circumstances, nuclear weapons always cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict. And therefore, everybody's got to understand that we got them and we're ready to use them. Then it goes on to say that it's important that planners should not be too rational about determining what the opponent values the most, all of which must be targeted. It hurts to portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed. That the United States may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be part of the national persona we project. It's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control. That sounds familiar. It's not an accident. This is 1995, remember. Then it goes on to say that nuclear weapons seem to be destined to be the centerpiece of U.S. strategic deterrence for the foreseeable future. We must reject a no first use policy, make it clear that our reactions will be response or preemptive. Notice that includes preemptive reaction, which is an interesting concept. We have to reject the stated goal of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and should not agree to what are called negative security assurances that ban the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states that have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. These were apparently confirmed by Clinton's internal U.S. nuclear posture. That's the predecessor of the current Rumsfeld one, and subsequent presidential directives. We don't have all the evidence on this because it's recent years and a lot is still classified, but this is what's out, the kind of thing that's out if you want to look at it. And it's not a big secret. You can find it in, I've written about it and you can find the data if you like. Well, that's, it's true that there's a change. The new programs that are on the front page now do apparently intensify what had already existed, kind of thing I've just quoted. And it is true that it's under the pretext of international terrorism. But I think the word pretext should be stressed. It was going on when there was no pretext of international terrorism. Though it's worth remembering that the reason we, in 1979, that Herman and I talked about state terrorism is because it was one of the major problems of the world. And within a year, 2 years, it had become the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. The war on terror, so-called, was declared 20 years ago in very much the same terms it is today, and it's been redeclared periodically since without very much change. The 200,000 corpses in Central America are one of the indices of what that war has meant. Topics which would be discussed, in fact headlined, if there was a press or journals that were interested in the topic of the war on terror, for pretty obvious reasons. It's not ancient history. And in fact, the same people are involved who were carrying out the so-called war on terror then. The intensification of the nuclear weapons programs, that's the headlines on the front pages today, is part of a larger story. September 11th was also used as a pretext to sharply escalate other military programs. In my opinion, the most dangerous of them is the militarization of space program, which has also been going on for years. It's under the rubric of missile defense, but whenever you hear the word defense, what you should understand is offense. And in fact, both adversaries and advocates recognize that even the small component called missile defense is an offensive weapon. There's no dispute about that. The goal is quite explicit. Again, you can read it in high-level government documents, Clinton's Space Command, or strategic analysts who write in major journals. The goal is what they call hegemony, that is protecting U.S. commercial interests and investments, and the analogies given to navies in earlier years, which had the same purpose, but now we go on to the next frontier, space, and that one the U.S. will monopolize, it's assumed, because it's so far ahead that there won't be any competitors. Well, in order to, I won't go into this, but in order to monopolize it, you have to have massive offensive capacities. Everybody realizes this. They have to be on hair-trigger alert. That raises very rapidly the risk of destruction, quite apart from calling forth responses from others. And that's understood. There's no disagreement that all of this raises the risks seriously, just as the current plans do. That's understood too. But it really doesn't matter. In this case, it happens to be total destruction. So like anything goes wrong, it's finished. But it doesn't matter much because hegemony, the announced goal, is much more highly valued than survival under the governing values. Nothing particularly novel about that. It's the scale of the consequences that's novel. Well, that again is what ought to be in the headlines, including the background. It's not new. It's greatly enhanced under the pretext of international terrorism and a very vulgar exploitation of the fear and concern of the population, which offers a kind of window opportunity to ram through all sorts of programs that powerful systems want to implement but can't if the public is paying attention. It's happening all over the world. What's the connection of all of this to terrorism? Well, approximately zero. There are terrorist threats to the United States. There's no doubt about that, and plenty of terrorist threats to the rest of the world. But just keeping the threats to the United States, they're real. Some of them were on the front pages too in the last couple of days. Here's Xeroxed a couple. New York Times had a front page story on March 7th about a real threat, namely what are called dirty bombs. Probably read that. Radioactive materials that are in wide use in the United States could be turned into, at least theoretically, it's not easy to do in practice, but could in principle be turned into weapons of terror that might kill few people, but even though only a few people would be killed, they would spread panic and produce severe economic damage. What they're talking about is bars of radioactive cobalt, which are used to irradiate food and medical devices and various other things like that. And they say that that could leave, if anybody could figure out how to distribute that stuff, say, over New York City, which is not, apparently isn't impossible in principle, it would leave wide areas with radiation levels which are above EPA limits, and that would cause, though not many deaths, would cause panic and a lot of problems. So that's a real weapon of terror. Well, how does, say, missile defense or nuclear weapons deal with that? Well, you can figure it out. And there are plenty of other dangers of that kind, but they're not addressed by the new military systems, nor are they intended to be. This is, we kind of like anniversaries, as you know, and this happens to be the 40th anniversary this month of John F. Kennedy's initial use of chemical weapons in South Vietnam. The authorization of chemical weapons in South Vietnam was actually earlier. It was November 1961. It was in November 1961 that the client regime, using U.S. helicopters, was equipped with facilities for for chemical warfare. And in March 1962, so that's just 40 years, it was publicly announced that U.S. pilots were flying planes that were involved in strafing and combat missions against the South Vietnamese. The goal was to destroy the economy and social fabric of areas where the population was resisting the regime that the United States had installed, the client regime. There was no pretense of anybody else around except South Vietnamese. Also at that same time, around March 62, Kennedy started clandestine operations against North Vietnam, but that was kind of like a fringe operation. The attack was mainly against the South. By 1962, U.S. air and firepower in South Vietnam exceeded the peak that had been reached by France in its war against Indochina to try to recover it 10 years earlier, which the U.S. had indeed backed. And occasionally there's some mention of this. Boston Globe, as far as I'm aware, the only newspaper in the United States. I had a friend do a database search on this. The only one he could find that mentioned wire service reports. There are a lot of wire service reports that came out this month about a meeting going on in Vietnam where one of the leading U.S. specialists on the topic, a professor at of the School of Public Health at the University of Texas, released his studies on blood tests of people in South Vietnam who were living near areas where the U.S. had used chemical warfare, Agent Orange, intensively, and found dioxin levels about 200 times above the average, what he called startlingly high levels of cancer-causing dioxin. Well, this is only South Vietnam, incidentally. North Vietnam was spared this particular atrocity. But although it's front-page news that somebody might figure out a way to cause few deaths but a lot of panic in the United States with chemical weapons, it's no news at all that we're now commemorating the 40th anniversary of our massive use of chemical warfare with unknown consequences against South Vietnam, one part of a extremely murderous war, which also doesn't enter the discussion of genocide. Notice, never mentioned. Again, on the same principle, wrong agent, therefore a wrong story. What's the scale of the deaths just from cancer and birth deformities and so on in South Vietnam? Well, nobody knows, because another principle is you don't investigate your own crimes. You only make claims about other people's crimes and posture grandly about how awful they are and how marvelous we are. So nothing's known in detail, but there has been some reporting. One of the top Israeli reporters, Amnon Kapeliuk, went to South Vietnam in 1988 and wrote a series of stories in the Hebrew press there, in which he estimated, as far as he could figure out, that there were about 250,000 victims of cancer and what he called hideous birth deformities, described mutilated fetuses and so on and so forth. I don't know if the number, again, it's only South Vietnam. That was 1988. They're still going on. The person I just cited says, yes, there's still new cases, some of them years after the termination of the chemical warfare. But it's basically none of our business. When you write articles about our failure to deter genocide when carried out by others, you don't talk about our casual implementation of mass murder because we're entitled to do that. That's our métier, more or less. So why talk about it? Actually, there are some reports about it. I don't want to say it's never discussed. About 10 years ago, the New York Times did have a report by Barbara Crissett in its science section on this topic, in which she pointed out that the United States is really missing an important opportunity by not studying the effects of its chemical warfare in Vietnam. The reason is that there's an almost perfect control situation. The people in the North and the South have approximately the same genes, no difference between them, but only the South, which was the main target of the U.S. attack all through, was subjected to chemical warfare. So therefore, if we sort of overcame our irrational unwillingness to study the problem, we might look at this controlled populations and learn something that would be useful to us. And therefore, it's really silly not to investigate it. You can check the article and see if there's any other reason to investigate it. The idea that we might do something about it is, of course, so outlandish that nobody can even mention it, like reparations, for example. It's quite the contrary. They have to pay reparations to us. Vietnam was required to take over the debt of the client government to the United States in order to be allowed to enter the world system. That means they were required to take the debt, to pay the costs of conquering and destroying South Vietnam before they're allowed to enter the world system, and that was considered quite reasonable as well, and doesn't enter any discussions about international terrorism or deterring genocide or anything else. Well, that's more of today's news. The Globe mentioned it in the World News Briefs. So if you do a database check, you won't find it, because I guess that's not, doesn't seem to be indexed, at least my friend couldn't find it. But there were a few lines there. That's nice. These events do tell us something important, though, well, many things. But one of the things they indicate to us is how much things have changed. I didn't ask Cynthia, but I'll bet anything that the Village Voice correspondent asked her to comment on the fact that there had been so much protest during the Vietnam War, and now there's nothing. So what happened? The truth is precisely the opposite. There was no protest during the Vietnam War. So when this stuff was going on, you couldn't get two people in a room to talk about it. In fact, it was years before any protest developed. In fact, the protest level was so low right through to the end, right until the day, that nobody even knows that we attacked South Vietnam. Although we certainly did. As I said, this is the 40th anniversary of the public announcement of it, and it went on to horrendous proportions. But since there was no protest at all, it's just disappeared from history. 5 or 6 years later, a protest did develop. I mean, by that time, nobody knows how many hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered in South Vietnam, millions of refugees, country half destroyed. War had expanded the rest of Indochina. By then, it was possible to get some protests. And among the public, it turned out there were substantial protests by the end of the 1960s. But contrary to everything you read, there was almost no protest among educated people. It was virtually non-existent. And you can see how low it is by looking at the way it's dealt with right today. So a couple of years ago, a book came out by Robert McNamara, which you I'm sure know of. It's in retrospect. And the reaction to the book was kind of interesting. The book was criticized by the Hawks because it was treachery, and welcomed by the Doves. That's the interesting part. It was welcomed almost across the board by the Doves as vindicating their stand. Well, how did McNamara vindicate their stand? He vindicated it by saying that by apologizing, not to the Vietnamese, there's no apology to them, but by apologizing to the American people for having caused them a lot of problems, because he didn't come clean early enough about the difficulties there would be in conquering South Vietnam. And he should have been more honest about that, and he apologized for that error. So that vindicates the position of the Doves as they themselves see it. And that's correct. That's approximately what the level of the criticism was among educated sectors. Sort of comparable to what you might have found among, say, German generals after Stalingrad, when there was criticism of Hitler for tactical errors in fighting a two-front war and not coming clean to the German people about how difficult it was going to be to win under those conditions. Among educated sectors, that's called criticism. and they're now surprised that there isn't such a fantastic level of criticism today, although even that was after 6 or 7 years of attacking South Vietnam. Well, the fact of the matter is it's totally different. The 60s had a civilizing effect on the general population, and no president could dream of doing what Kennedy could easily get away with 40 years ago, or what could even be done 20 years ago. There's just way too much opposition. It's much deeper, it's much broadly spread through the population, right through the mainstream, and that's a serious impediment to violence. Not anywhere near enough, but it's certainly better than it was in the past. In fact, I can't remember any time, at least where there's been so much protest over involving an international conflict at anything like a comparable stage. Certainly the Vietnam War was radically different. Well, let's turn to the current, other aspects of the current situation. I won't talk much about international terrorism. There's a lot to say about it. Let's take a look at West Asia. What's going on there? Well, the two main foci of attention. One is the Israel-Palestine conflict. The other is pending war in Iraq. Let's take a look at the first. And, well, actually, let's borrow a phrase from our leader, who is very worried about what he calls enhancing terror in Israel and Palestine, blaming it primarily on the Palestinians, in fact, almost all. So how do you go about enhancing terror in the Israel-Palestine conflict? Well, the United States gave a good illustration of how to do this in December. In last December, there was a Security Council debate over a resolution initiated by the European Union calling for measures to implement the U.S. Mitchell Plan and to reduce the level of violence by the obvious means, namely introducing international monitors. That's a good way to lower the level of violence. Worked elsewhere, could work there. The U.S. vetoed the resolution. It then immediately went to the General Assembly, where the U.S. voted against it, along with Israel. And usually the U.S. and Israel vote alone against such resolutions, or in fact most resolutions. But in this case, the U.S. did pick up another couple of countries, a few Pacific islands, so it wasn't alone in enhancing terror. Had some allies. When the U.S. votes against something, it's not only vetoed, but vetoed from the public record. So there's virtually no mention of this in the press, and it'll disappear from history. This was an important period because it was right in the middle of a 21-day period of what is called quiet in the Israel-Palestine conflict, which means only Palestinians were killed. About 20 Palestinians were killed, about half of them children, but there was very little other violence, so it was a period of quiet, and that's when the U.S. intervened to enhance terror in this fashion. Very efficient way to do it. It wasn't the only example. 10 days earlier, on December 5th, there was an important meeting in Switzerland, which was also vetoed from history. You can search, you won't find any discussion of it, very little discussion. This was a meeting of the high contracting parties of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Conventions were established right after the Second World War to formally criminalize the crimes of the Nazis. That was their purpose. The Fourth Geneva Convention dealt with occupied territories. This was a meeting there are what are called high contracting parties, that is, parties which, of course, the United States is one, which are bound by solemn treaty to act to enforce the conventions in any circumstances. The meeting was in Switzerland because Switzerland is the country that's the repository for dealing with this. Every country in the world, with the exception of Israel, literally says that holds that the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories. Furthermore, it is international law. It's been reiterated at the Security Council without a negative vote. So, for example, in October 2001, the Security Council voted without a veto, without a negative vote, that the Geneva Conventions do apply to the occupied territories. The vote was 14-0, but with one abstention. The United States abstains on those votes. It does not want to come out openly opposing the conventions that were instituted to criminalize the crimes of the Nazis, so it therefore abstains, which kills them, keeps them out of the press and the historical record, and of course makes them inapplicable. This was Clinton, remember, not Bush. That same thing happened on December 5th of last year. The United States boycotted the meeting, so it's finished. It didn't matter that every participant voted for a strong resolution holding that the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories, which entails that virtually everything the United States is doing there, meaning Israel's doing with U.S. arms, weapons, economic aid, diplomatic support, that's all illegal. Illegal means technically what's called a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, which is a war crime by any standard. But it doesn't matter. The U.S. boycotted it, so therefore it's out of the discussion. And the possibility of reducing the level of violence by the means supported by the entire world in this case, U.S. accepted, are out of the discussion. That's not the only case. This includes all the settlements, that the U.S. pays for, our tax dollars pay for them, that the U.S. protects with military aid, diplomatic support, and so on. It's all gone. The same is true of, if you read this morning's papers, you see that very happy that the Israeli Prime Minister made what's called a concession. Namely, he's allowing Yasser Arafat to leave his little prison, the room to which he's been confined for the last couple of months, just in order to make sure everybody understands what this is. Yesterday, what's called Israel. When you hear about Israeli helicopters attacking something, that means U.S. helicopters, right? Israel doesn't produce helicopters or F-16s. So when you read Israeli helicopters attacked something with missiles, that means U.S. helicopters provided to Israel for that purpose, with the certain knowledge that that's what they're going to be used for, did whatever they did. In this case, a couple days ago, they wiped out the headquarters of that the Palestinian Authority had been constructing in Gaza for potential state headquarters. There's no significance to this other than humiliation, which is the core principle for dealing with the lower breeds. Every Westerner understands this. You got to humiliate them, not just kill them, but humiliate them. It's very important. But now Israel, meaning the United States, made a concession. It's allowing Arafat to get out of his prison to which he's been confined. The reason for letting him out is allegedly that they arrested some people who Israel wants them to arrest for killing an Absoluti minister, Minister Sayyaf, tourist minister. That's considered a crime. Of course, it is a crime. And the crime is not absolved by the fact that it was retaliation for an earlier crime, a couple of weeks earlier, namely the murder of Abu Ali Mustafa, who's the first political leader, pure, straight political leader to have been purposely assassinated in this conflict. He was assassinated by what's called an Israeli helicopter, meaning a U.S. helicopter, which killed him and introduced straight political assassination for the first time. Sayyaf was a retaliation. But the Abu Ali Mustafa assassination isn't a crime. In fact, you might explore to see how that's been covered here. It's not a crime, and nobody is confined to his room because he didn't arrest the people responsible for that crime, which obviously wouldn't make any sense anyway, because everyone knows who's responsible. They're sitting in the White House and in the government offices in Tel Aviv, so you don't have to confine them to any rooms. You know exactly who they are. It's not a question. You don't have to search for them. But it doesn't count on the same principles that I've been mentioning. Who sent the helicopters? Well, for that we can primarily credit Bill Clinton, although Bush has been continuing too. Just to remind you, the current conflict, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, actually began on September 29th of the year 2000. I'm virtually quoting the U.S. Mitchell report at this point, when the Israeli government, at the day after Sharon had entered the Al-Aqsa compound, the mosque, with a big entourage of military as a pure provocation and no other purpose. The day after that, Prime Minister Barak the next day was a Friday, the day of prayers, surrounded it with about 1,000 soldiers, and when people came out of the mosque and some kids started throwing stones, they shot at them. Before it was over, half a dozen people were killed, and that took off from there. On the first day, October 1st, September 30th, October 1st, October 2nd, Israel began using U.S. helicopters to attack civilian targets, apartment complexes, others, killing a couple dozen people. On October 3rd, Clinton made the biggest deal in a decade to send Israel new helicopters, biggest deal in a decade, including spare parts for Apache attack helicopters that had been sent a couple of weeks earlier. Well, that's a terrific way of enhancing terror. I mean, as soon as our client starts using our helicopters there was no Palestinian fire at that time. It was just stone throwing. But as soon as our client state, offshore military base, starts using our attack helicopters to murder civilians, the way to enhance terror is obviously to send them more. Well, that's the government. The press can also cooperate in enhancing terror, namely by not reporting it, and they didn't. So if you check, you discover that although there's perfectly public knowledge, like reading the Israeli press or the military journals and so on, the press refused to report it. Notice, I'm not saying failed to report it, but rather refused, because it was specifically brought to the attention of editors of leading journals, and they essentially said this is not the right story. So to this day, it hasn't been reported except, in the dissident press. Bush continued when he came into office, and so you have what are called Israeli helicopters, meaning our helicopters, carrying out assassinations and other atrocities, including the Abu Ali Mustafa murder. How many have there been? Well, according to the Israeli press, they say 48 people have been assassinated, liquidated, they say, without a trial, and another 26 happened to be killed who were at the site of the liquidations. The Palestinian Human Rights Group gives the figure of 66, but let's keep to the Israeli figures. So 48 killed and 26 others just happened to be around. There were more yesterday, incidentally, so it goes on. The reporter, Gideon Levy in Haaretz, gives a lot of shocking examples. But it's not, and he also points out, the occasion for his article is that there was a protest to the High Court, an appeal to the High Court, like the Supreme Court, to rule against targeted assassination, a lot of them with helicopters. And the court denied the request, saying that it saw no reason to put an end to these assassinations. So there's no, as Levy points out, there's no way to appeal to anyone in Israel. All they can do is appeal to an international tribunal, since the Israeli government, meaning the U.S. government, because remember, they can act up to the point where the U.S. authorizes it, not an inch beyond. So these will go on. What about diplomacy? Well, there is some talk about diplomacy. Right now there's a lot of talk about a Saudi Arabian plan. It was announced by Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, great excitement and lots of self-congratulation for having initiated it. And as he and others pointed out, at last, for the first time, the Arabs are willing to make peace. There's been a lot of reporting about this. Some of the reporting, including the Globe, which has one of the best reporters in the region, did point out, and they're right to do so, that this is sort of similar to a plan that Saudi Arabia put forth in 1981, the FAD plan. In fact, it's virtually identical to it. But that plan, according to the reports, was killed by the Arab states who didn't want to make peace with Israel. Well, that's not quite exact, so I'll just quote from the second book that Southend was nice enough to publish for me, Fateful Triangle. This is 1983. Right after the first plan came along, here's what actually happened. Try to search for it in the press. Shimon Peres, the leading dove, said that the Saudi Arabian plan threatened Israel's very existence. The Labor Party's official newspaper said that the Israeli government, in reaction to the Saudi peace plan, had sent military aircrafts over Saudi Arabia, effectively warning the United States that if the United States showed any interest in this plan, they'd blow up the oil fields. So it's a threat to the United States with U.S. Phantom jets, incidentally. That's not an unusual conjuncture that's been going on for a while. They didn't have to worry about it because the U.S. wasn't going to allow the plan anyway, but they were worried. The Labor Party journal described this Israeli reaction as so irrational as to cause foreign intelligence services to get out of their files their plans about Israeli bombing of the Saudi oil fields. Amos Elon, a very distinguished correspondent, described it as shocking, the Israeli reaction as shocking, frightening, if not downright despair-producing. And similar comments go over to the center-right. Yoel Marcus condemned what he called the frightened, almost hysterical response to the Saudi plan. He said it's a grave mistake. Claim's president, Chaim Herzog, Labor dove, he wrote about it. He said the real author of the Saudi plan is the PLO, and he added that he said that the plan that the Saudi PLO plan was even more extreme than a Security Council resolution of January 1976, which he says was prepared by the PLO. He was at that time Israel's UN ambassador. The plan, and there was such a proposal at the Security Council, it was proposed by the Arab confrontation states, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. It was in fact backed by the entire world, by the Russians, Europe, Latin America, all the Arab states, everyone. It was vetoed by the United States, which as usual means vetoed from history, so none of this is discussed. What did the plan call for? Well, it called for the full implementation of official U.S. policy, that is UN 242, which calls for recognized borders and the right of every state to live in peace and security and so on, but with a Palestinian state in the occupied territories. There were then subsequent plans from Saudi Arabia and other Arab states, Europe and others, all blocked by the United States, up to the 1981 plan, which caused such hysteria. Actually, Herzog's comments were not correct. The Saudi Arabian plan was not any different from the January 76 plan, and his claim that both of them were prepared by the PLO is almost certainly false. But it is a reflection of the hysteria among Israeli doves over the threat that there might be a peace proposal that maybe the U.S. would take seriously, although there was very little chance of that because the U.S. was strongly opposed to a peaceful diplomatic settlement and has in fact succeeded in blocking any such settlement for the past 25 years, which again would be headlines if there was any interest in anything but enhancing terror. What was in fact the U.S. reaction? Actually, we don't really know that in detail because nothing's ever reported. Since the U.S. is blocking peace and enhancing violence, it just can't be reported. So we know very little about this, and you can only pick up pieces. You can see what the actions were, but we don't know much about the reasons, though you can easily guess, speculate pretty well, in fact, from other sources. And that's discussed in Fateful Triangle and elsewhere. And this continues up to the present, incidentally, up to the very present. I wrote it up to December 2001, but it's a lot of stuff in between. When the first Saudi plan was proposed, the FAD plan, in August 1981, that was right at the time when Israel, with U.S. backing, because remember, they can't do anything without U.S. backing, Israel was beginning to plan the invasion of Lebanon, which took place the following summer. The purpose of the invasion of Lebanon, and the reason for the invasion of Lebanon, it was perfectly open in Israel, was to try to prevent the PLO from continuing its extremely annoying policies of trying to move towards a diplomatic settlement, which Israel doesn't really mind terror much, but they do mind negotiations and diplomacy, because that might mean you have to relinquish the occupied territory. Terror you can kind of deal with. So the idea was to try to prevent the PLO from pursuing these efforts by just driving them out of Lebanon. That was the goal. Finally, I have to give credit where it's due, it finally reached the American press after 20 years of perfectly clear information. I mean, if you take a look at Fateful Triangle, a lot of quotes from the top Israeli officials, Israeli press, and many more in the following years. But it did reach the New York Times on January 24th of this year. The James Bennett has an article in which he points out accurately that the Israeli government's goal in invading Lebanon, and incidentally killing about 20,000 people, the goal was to install a friendly regime and destroy Mr. Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization. That, the theory went, would help persuade Palestinians to accept Israeli rule in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That's accurate. And it's nice that after 20 years it finally made it to a kind of a, line inside a story which nobody will notice, but at least it's there. So now we can quote the New York Times. We don't have to quote massive documentation from the Israeli press and journals and the dissident press here. All of that's, notice that that's a textbook illustration of international terrorism, right? It's the use of force to try to attain political goals by intimidation and fear. Actually, it goes way beyond international terrorism. It's a war crime for which you have Nuremberg trials, but it's at least international terrorism. In fact, a major case of it. Backing by the United States all the way right to the present. It's also worth noticing another improvement, namely Thomas Friedman. In the early 1980s, he was the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem, the mid-80s, and there, he was regularly, he reads Hebrew, he was regularly reading headlines in the Israeli Hebrew press, mainstream press, saying, Arafat calls for negotiations, Paris says no. And he would use the occasion of those headlines to write articles in the New York Times lamenting the fact that the Israeli peace movement has no partners, the other side only wants to kill all the Jews and won't talk about peace, and quoting Shimon Peres with tears in his eyes, saying if only there was somebody as beautiful as we were who would negotiate with us, we would get somewhere. The New York Times and other newspapers, almost all other newspapers, simply refused to print any of this. They would not print any of the offers that were coming because it just tells you too much about the truth. In 1988, Friedman won the Pulitzer Prize for the excellence of his reporting from Jerusalem. I happened to be in Israel at the time that he got the prize, and I read the interviews he was giving in the Hebrew press, which I think was mostly ridiculing him, I think. I don't think he realized it. The interviews are kind of interesting. I've written about him in English. He starts by explaining that he certainly deserves the Pulitzer Prize because he's the first reporter ever who was able to explain to anybody what was really going on there. Up until then, it was a total mystery. And then when they ask him, what does he think, what does he recommend that they should do with the occupied territories? And his recommendation is that Israel should treat them like southern Lebanon, which at that time was under Israeli military occupation, run by a mercenary army, kind of paramilitaries, brutal, murderous paramilitaries, with a huge torture chamber in Khiam there in case anybody got out of line. So Friedman said that's the way you should run the occupied territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But remember, he's a liberal, so he added, however, he said you should give the Arabs something, because, I'm quoting it now, if you give Ahmed a seat in the bus, he may lessen his demand. Okay, so therefore you should give him something. Around the same time, 1988, I suppose, I don't read the South African press, but I imagine among the more extreme South African racists, you might have found somebody who would say, yeah, let's keep our boot on these guys' necks, but give them something, because if you give Sambo a seat in the bus, he may lessen his demands. Maybe. If so, then they reach the level of respected American liberal correspondents. Well, Friedman has progressed. He no longer apparently believes that, and he now is in favor of the Saudi Arabian peace plan of 1981, which the U.S. vetoed at the Security Council in January 1976 and has been opposing ever since. Well, that's just a sample of what ought to appear in the press if we want to understand what's going on there, small sample. And unless we're willing to face realities like that, there's no point even pretending to be talking about what's happening. Well, that's one aspect of West Asia. What about, I'll end with the next one, what about the axis of evil, the next phase in the war of terror? First question is why George Bush's speechwriters decided to pick that phrase, axis of evil. Well, you know, here, remember, this is just speculation. We don't have internal deliberation, so I'll speculate. I presume the reason for using the word evil is because it plays to the domestic audience. At least you can reduce them to the level of children reading fairy tales. So if you can sort of frighten people enough so they kind of huddle under the shadow of the heroic leader, maybe you can get them to think that the hero, semi-divine hero, is protecting them from evil, you know, like you remember when you were a kid. Or ancient epics, although they at least have the literary quality. It's different from the plagiarism. And it's very important to do that. Because you have to somehow prevent people from watching the attack against them that's being launched by the administration, which is very serious. It's serious on just straight economic grounds, but even more serious if you think of the other plans, like the militarization plans or the plans to destroy the environment, all of which may really literally bring the species to an end. But you certainly don't want people to pay attention to that, or the tax cuts for the rich, or the Enron scandal, or you know the other methods or the efforts to silence domestic independence. None of this is proper to look at, and the best way to keep people from looking at it is to have them huddling in terror. So there's big evil out there. I assume the same is true about this escapade that's going on in the Philippines. I mean, I imagine that the Pentagon has the resources to overcome a couple of dozen criminals who are running around some island off the Philippines. That sounds like a plausible conjecture. When it has nothing to do with international terrorism. The reason the Philippine Army can't do it is probably because they're so involved in the same criminal activities that they're corrupt and they can't manage it. But I imagine maybe mini nukes or something that can handle this. And when they do it, it'll be possible for the hero to stand up and read the words written by his speechwriters, which say how we've overcome evil again and we can now rest a little more safe, but crucially don't pay attention to what we're doing to you. So I assume all this is for domestic consumption. What about the axis? Well, you know, I suppose the people who wrote the words know, even if Bush doesn't know what the word axis refers to, there was an axis, but it surely doesn't apply to Iran and Iraq and North Korea. I mean, Iran and Iraq have been at war for 20 years, and North Korea's got nothing to do with it. So whatever it is, it's not an axis. But again, that has the kind of right flavor. It suggests the Nazis and, you know, German troops marching all over the world and so on. Of the whole axis of evil, there's one component of it which may actually be implemented, namely an attack on Iraq. And there are reasons for that. Reasons which have nothing, we know for certain that the reasons have nothing to do with Saddam Hussein's crimes. The reason we know that is that during the period of his worst crimes, by far, the U.S. and Britain were supporting him and continued to support him right through the atrocities and afterwards for several years because they didn't care. That included his development of weapons of mass destruction with the assistance of U.S. and British aid, dual technology assistance, which could be applied to weapons of mass destruction, as they knew. And back at that time, in the late 80s, he really was a threat, much more so than now. You know, now Iraq's very much weakened, but then it was a real threat. So we know for certain that can't be the reason. I mean, you'll hear over and over again, as you've been hearing for a long time, that we can't let this guy survive because the ultimate criminal, you know, did all these terrible things, gassed his own people, etc. All of which is true, just missing three little words, namely, with our support, you know, which continued. So whatever the reasons may be, it's not those reasons that we can be confident about. What are the reasons? Well, it's not very hard to figure out. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia. You'd be quite confident that one way or another, the U.S. is going to act to regain control over those oil reserves and their distribution and sale, and to deny them to adversaries. At the moment, France and Russia have kind of like a privileged access to them, along with Dick Cheney and his company, incidentally. But the U.S. doesn't have privileged access to them and control over them. So something will be done to rectify that. And it's possible that they think that this is this is an opportunity to somehow achieve this. Just this morning, the Globe reports, probably correctly, a split between CIA and State Department on one hand and the Pentagon on the other as to who to use to try to restore the system of U.S. control. The CIA and the State Department are dealing with Iraqi generals who in fact include the ones responsible for the Halabja chemical warfare and other atrocities. But that's okay, because remember, it really wasn't the atrocities or the development of weapons of mass destruction that was a problem. It was disobedience. It's a real problem. So that part of the story could be accurate. The countries of the region are very concerned about it. I just got back from Turkey, where there's a lot of discussion and concern about what the press and the policy analysts there claim, I can't prove it, is U.S. pressure to get them to be willing to serve as sort of ground forces for some kind of a planned invasion. It's been a little bit discussed here, and I don't know if it's true, but anyway, that's their conception. And they don't like it. The Prime Minister again today said he didn't like it. He was worried about the consequences. But maybe something like that will happen. Well, that brings us up to the present. Obviously a lot more to say, but it illustrates very well the kind of contribution that institutions like South End and others like it, many have spawned from it, in fact, can make. They offer ways in which the public can discover what's going on in the world. That includes domestically and internationally, even if it violates the principles. The principle that you only pretend to be upset about other people's crimes, you obscure your own, you eliminate from history anything that doesn't fit nicely. And these are really important things for people to understand, not just intellectually, even if they're just interested in simple things like survival, because at this point that's really threatened. Okay. Are there mics down there? Anybody think of putting mics out? No? No mics? Okay. Oh, I'll try to repeat. Okay. If any, it's a good idea to stand up because people won't hear you.
Professor, a couple of days ago on one of the Navy C-SPAN or something, I saw someone affiliated with the Director of Homeland Security. That was
The which?
This guy was either from the FBI or associated with the Director of Homeland Security.
Oh.
And he was a little sheepishly embarrassed because apparently there was a state of emergency or alert around the country, but he was unable to define exactly what the emergency was. And there were 3 levels of alert, and the alert was at different levels at different parts of the country, but there was no explanation because there was no definition of what the emergency was. So I wonder if you could address that.
Well, the question was, this is a report that there was some state of emergency called at various levels throughout the country without any definition of what the emergency was. It's really, I didn't see the report, but it's impossible to judge. I mean, there could well be threats. There are constant threats in the United States, like the one I mentioned, and much worse threats around the world, because remember, around the world, people are subjected to the violence and terror of the powerful states like us and their clients, which is just orders of magnitude beyond the threats here. So yes, there are threats constantly. Maybe this was real, maybe it wasn't. Since, as you say, nothing was said about it, you just can't judge. So what do the United States or Russia or others look like 50 years from now in West Asia? Nobody can say a word about that. I mean, the record of prediction in human affairs is grotesque. You can't predict the behavior of insects. You can't predict tomorrow's weather. To predict anything like human affairs is just totally hopeless. And there's one very good reason for that, over and above insects, is that it depends on what people decide to do. It's very much a matter of will and choice. So what you, for example, decide to do will make a difference. And since nobody knows what you're going to do, or many other people like you can't predict what will happen. Now, those are not questions for it's just idle speculation. It's useless. It's a matter of deciding what you want them to look like 50 years from now and doing something about it.
Did you address the need, if there is any at all, after December 11th, for any kind of curtailing of civil liberties, and what do you see the repercussions of the Patriot Act and the fervent patriotism, nationalism, and
Well, the purpose of the Patriot Act and other things like it, and the effect of them, is pretty clear. It's to try to subdue the public so that powerful sectors can ram through their own programs. Okay? So it would have been impossible to push through things like, you just name it. I mean, capital gains taxes, increased militarization of space, what's called trade enhancement legislation, fast track. You just couldn't push those things through unless the public was subdued by demands that you be patriotic while we'll go ahead and do whatever we want and won't be patriotic. So the fear of the public and their quite plausible concern has been exploited for this purpose, not just in the United States. I mean, that's worldwide. Almost every country you look at, something similar is happening. Because everyone understood right away, every harsh, repressive force in the world recognized instantly that they've got a window of opportunity. And it takes different forms in different countries. Like in Russia, it means intensifying the atrocities in Chechnya. In the more democratic societies like the United States or England or whatever, it means, protection against terrorism acts which try to shut people up so you can do what you want. But that's the immediate effect. On the other hand, would it be justified to have some curtailment of civil liberties? Well, maybe. Like, I don't have any objection to going through security at airlines, say. Incidentally, you might ask yourself a question about how effective those security systems are at the airlines. Just imagine that some terrorist were actually caught at Logan Airport. Okay, would you read about it? Yeah, there'd be a headline on the front page of the next day's newspaper. Okay, just now ask yourself a simple question. How often have you read headlines like that? Anywhere, In fact, has anybody been ever caught by a security system? Maybe, I don't know. But I think if so, it's statistically so insignificant that it's probably non-existent. Although there's a huge effort and cost to individuals on it. So you can ask some serious questions about just what's going on. On the other hand, at least for myself, I don't see any objection to it. I think it's right. It's a curtailment of civil liberties, but maybe a justified one. Like, I don't want to get blown up if I'm in an airplane.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about the now unit dropped in the World Conference against racism in Durban, and along with your comments in general about it, in particular about the role and significance of Jew hatred that's emerged there.
Well, that was a feature. Yeah, could you hear? Oh, the question was about the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, and the Jew hatred was the phrase used that emerged there. That was the one and only topic that was allowed to be discussed in the United States. For a simple reason, the United States had decided to kill the meeting and walked out for that reason. What it's describing is not false. There was an element of that. Propaganda is rarely false. Even the most vulgar and ridiculous propaganda usually has some element of truth to it, otherwise you couldn't get away with it. And in this case, yes, there was an element. But what was called Jew hatred was pretty broadly construed. So, for example, if people were, say, in favor of applying the Geneva Conventions in the occupied territories, like 100% of the world is except the United States, that's Jew hatred. So it covers a wide range, but some of it qualifies. And that feature was there, and that's what you could talk about. It was a minor issue there. There were many much more serious issues, like caste prejudice, which is a huge problem. Countries like India, for example, it's a horror story. Prejudice against women, which is terribly serious. Straight outright racism, slavery, a lot of topics came up. But they're not, they don't pass through the filter for proper story. The outcome, the way in which the U.S. succeeded in not just the U.S., West pretty generally, but the U.S. in the lead, succeeded in marginalizing all of this was very strongly deplored all over the world. I mean, even by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, and it was not very pretty. But yes, that element was in there, and it was used as an excuse for essentially undermining the meetings. It was also condemned by Human Rights Watch, the reaction.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about how Colombia fits into the war on terrorism. I know it was mentioned early on one of the potential places that it could be expanded, but I don't know what the current state of U.S. intervention is or how they're looking to increase.
Well, what about Colombia was the question. I was just looking back a little. First of all, Colombia has a terrible history of violence. I mean, like about a century ago, maybe 100,000 people were killed in an internal war in Colombia. In the 1950s, it was a period in which a couple 100,000 were killed. The United States sort of got into it more. The basic reasons, they don't have to do with drugs. There were no drugs in those days. I mean, what they basically have to do with is the fact that Colombia is a potentially very rich country. It's got a lot of resources. But even by Latin American standards, which are awful, some of the worst in the world, even by Latin American standards, the level of inequality and poverty and so on is extreme. There's a very small part of the population which is highly privileged and wealthy, and most of the population is kind of out of it. So when you read polls saying Colombians think this, that, or something else, you have to qualify it by recognizing that probably half the people in Colombia, there's no way even to reach. They don't have a telephone, never heard of a telephone. They're living in abysmal poverty, and we don't have any idea what they're thinking. And the U.S. got into it significantly 40 years ago. Again, it's another 40th anniversary we can celebrate if we like. 40 years ago, Kennedy, as part of his general program of enhancing violence throughout Latin America, what was called counterinsurgency, sent a special forces mission to Colombia, headed by a Green Beret general, which gave the Colombian army advice on how to deal with what they call terrorism, insurgencies. And the advice was to use paramilitaries. That makes sense. It always makes sense to farm out brutalities to paramilitaries rather than to carry them out yourself. Everybody does this. So to use paramilitaries and to train them to use terror. That was the word used. So the Colombian army was advised to resort to paramilitary terror against, I'm quoting it now, known communist proponents. Okay, in the Latin American context, known communist proponents means anybody who's out of line, like union leaders or human rights activists or priests organizing peasants, or they're known communist proponents, and they should be targeted by paramilitary terror. Well, you read Colombian Army training manuals, they do change at that point, to talk about the need to fight a dedicated war against the civilian population. This was happening all over Latin America, incidentally. Colombia is one case. And it led to an enormous plague of repression throughout the continent. Colombia was pretty bad. The guerrillas did try in 1985. They were offered. There were a lot of fluctuations up and back. In 1985, there was a kind of relaxation, and they were offered an opportunity to enter the political system, which they did. They started a political party, Patriotic Union Party, which ran for elections, mayors, presidential candidates. Didn't last very long because they were mostly assassinated. About 3,500 or so activists were just killed by the military and the paramilitary associates, including presidential candidates, mayors, and so on. So that party sort of gone. By 1990, Colombia had the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, not only because its record was getting worse, but because the atrocities in El Salvador and Guatemala were declining, since there they had already been successful in crushing domestic resistance. That's what's called here the war against terror, namely enhancing terror. Colombia got the worst. Since then, Colombia has had the worst human rights record in the hemisphere. It's also had the highest military aid and military training, in fact, more than the rest of the hemisphere put together. In 1999, it reached the highest level in the world, replacing Turkey. This is aside from Israel and Egypt, separate category. But it was replaced Turkey. The reason was that Turkey, which had carried out monstrous atrocities in the southeast, thanks to our tax dollars again, Clinton was pouring arms into Turkey as the atrocities escalated. But by 1999, they sort of controlled it. Actually, I just came back from there and saw some of the consequences firsthand, but it was well known. And Colombia went in first place because they haven't suppressed the insurgency. And it's now escalating. Clinton's Plan Colombia added a big shot in the arm to the military and the paramilitaries who work very closely with them. Even the State Department describes them as responsible for the large majority of the atrocities, which is incidentally not to say that the guerrillas are nice guys. There's very little positive that you can say about them. But if you look at the distribution of atrocities or of drugs, it's mostly the military and the paramilitary. But the military aid is going to target the guerrillas, okay, not the paramilitaries or the military. Obviously, they're getting the aid. And now it's probably going to go up. The pretext is a drug war. but it's a very thin pretext. I mean, if this was drug war, they'd be going first of all, if they were trying to eliminate drug production, they'd be going after the paramilitaries. I mean, they themselves say publicly on television that they're getting 70% of their income from drugs. But if you notice, none of the military aid is going to do anything against them. And they're responsible for most of the atrocities. And you can't go against them because they're too closely linked to the military, which we're aiding. Furthermore, there's a lingering question in the background, and that is what right the United States has, even if it wanted to go after peasants who are producing coca in Colombia. Do we have any right to do that? Like, do they have a right to kill farmers in Kentucky and Tennessee, let's say, or North Carolina, who are growing tobacco, which ends up being sold as tobacco products that are far more lethal than cocaine? Because are they allowed to bomb North Carolina? So, no, it's outlandish. So even if you think that even if you believe that the purpose is to, say, fumigate coca fields, it just goes back to another question. Is anybody authorized to do that in some other country? Well, obviously not. We consider it outrageous if anything like that happened, except if we were doing it. So the whole question, and besides which, it just doesn't have anything to do with it. I mean, if the problem of drugs is here, it's not in Colombia, and everybody knows how to deal with it. The problem, it's a serious problem. It's not as serious as tobacco or alcohol, but it's serious. And the way to deal with it is agreed on. There isn't even any disagreement about it. It's prevention and treatment, which is much less expensive and much more cost-effective. But the money's going into something else for other reasons, which would be illegitimate even if those were the reasons. It's very likely that the war will escalate, with atrocities on both sides, and the people in the middle suffering. A lot of the population just wants to be left alone. There are local communities, Afro-Colombian communities, peasant communities, others, which just don't want to be attacked by anybody, not surprisingly. They don't like any of them. Just go away, leave us alone. And maybe progress could be made in those directions. A lot of things are happening domestically in Colombia which could be supported if there was any interest in lowering the level of atrocities and dealing with the fundamental problem, which is a deep problem of inequality and oppression. And as long as that lasts, there's not going to be any solution. Yeah.
I'm curious why the U.S. is interested in controlling Iraqi oil reserves today and what is the case like a valid reason for that.
So why is the U.S. interested in controlling Iraqi oil today but not in the 80s? Well, for one thing, in the 80s, I don't recall the exact numbers, but I think most of the oil was going through U.S. and British corporations. But at that point, the United States had a special interest. I mean, the reason that the U.S. and Britain and others were supporting Saddam Hussein was he was a weapon against Iran. Okay, there was a war going on, a major war, and probably the U.S. just kind of wanted them to kill each other. So if you look at the arms flow, it was actually going to both sides. Just let them kill each other off, and because we don't like either of you. Sooner or later, incidentally, the United States does not need that oil. In fact, the U.S. could get along without Middle East oil altogether. And if you look at U.S. intelligence projections about, oil dependence in the coming, say, 10 or 15 years, they focus on the Western Hemisphere, which has substantial oil reserves. In fact, the U.S. was trying to control Middle East oil even when it didn't use a drop of it. I mean, until around 1970, North America was the biggest oil producer in the world, the biggest exporter. And since then, Venezuela has been the major exporter to the United States, and there are others. But the intelligence projections are that the U.S. will rely primarily on Mexican, Venezuelan, Brazilian oil. And there are plenty of other possibilities, like conservation, for example. But Middle East oil is wanted for another reason, because it is overwhelmingly the biggest resource in the world, the cheapest, most available oil, and whoever controls it has a lever of world control. It's quite important. So 50 years ago, State Department, George Kennan, for example, was pointing out that even though we don't need Middle East oil, controlling it gives us what he called veto power over other countries. Like Japan gets out of line, we turn off the spigot. Also, there's plenty of profits that come. Remember, profits pour back to the West, primarily the United States. That was the last question I was told.